Welcome to Rails Around York.
My name is Don Bretz. I'm a member of Bible Baptist Church in York, Pennsylvania. And I've been asked to say a few things about my employment in the railroad industry for 44 years. And it's a privilege to be able to speak in this manner. Years ago, I'd have never dreamed that I would be going to do something like this. But when I came out of high school and graduated, I was due to be drafted probably in the services in 1945, and I went to work in the railroad to get situated in a place where when I come home I would be able to have some gainful employment. And so after a bit of time at an old engine house where we repaired steam locomotives, I went to the service and come back, and of course that was the age of diesel beginning in 1947 there. And I worked on air brake equipment as much as I could. I was interested in that type of work. And in due time, I was able to move up to a machinist position working on air brakes. And spent 44 years involved in many different things and concerning the moving of freight equipment over the lines. So I worked there in the what we called the air brake gang, and we repaired air brake equipment. And either periodically, air brake equipment must be replaced with equipment that's been cleaned and lubricated and tested on a test track and applied to the locomotives. Did that for a number of years. And about 1969, an opportunity arose for me to move on to another position, and particularly in Altoona, not exactly in the Altoona Works, but on the Allegheny Division. And I worked there with the materials and equipment for a number of years. An opportunity arose for me to work directly with the maintenance people in the car department, repairing the cars, and supervisor capacity. So we worked at that for a number of years, and had some surprising experiences that I never thought I'd never see in the railroad industry. But part of the territory that was involved with the shop and yard people in that area was we had a length of main line coverage for any thing that would go wrong on the main line. we would send our people out and correct the problem whatever it might be. Most of it was derailments, especially in the winter time when the ground froze and thawed. So it affected the rails and the ties and the road bed, and we would run into a lot of necessity of re-railing cars. And the Allegheny Mountains aren't exactly a summer spot in November through probably March, and we spent a lot of time assisting in keeping the roads open. I remember one particular time we had got a call from the superintendent's office. There was a tank car had derailed in the city, main line of Altoona, run right through the city, and there was a tank car derailed, and it was carrying a material that's used in making gasoline, producing gasoline. It's a lead contact material, and we weren't sure whether it was explosive. It was treated with tender care, I'll say that. The police department in Altoona was called in, and they evacuated as many people as they could out of a given area around that particular part of the city. And unfortunately, it derailed right under the 17th Street Bridge in Altoona, and there could be no derricks or cranes or nothing to get in there to re-rail it and move it on. So we drug the car out from under the bridge and was able to get it up on a temporary movement back into our shop area where we would need to set it up right and put permanent blocking in the different areas that would keep it from shifting. This lead material was lucid and would slop back and forth in the tank, and we called it Ethel. So Ethel had quite a time in Altoona for a while, and we moved it near our shop where we stored our equipment for derailments. And we had brought a crane in from up in the mountains ways, and with our use of our derrick, we were able to right the tank car. And since it was being shipped out through Cincinnati to one of the industries where they produce gasoline, we blocked it and did what was necessary to get it back on the road. So we set it up in a gondola, which was not a very good experience. When the crane got on each end of the tank car, this material was wasn't like water, but it was a liquid, a heavy liquid, and it would slosh back and forth in the tank, and it was very difficult to handle. And when it started to do that, we thought sure it was going to spill out over the car or in the ground or upset the derricks, and never handled anything quite that bad. So we set her down in the car just to try to stabilize it. It was in a gondola, and that material did not stabilize. It just kept sloshing back and forth sideways. And actually the crane operators released their lines and in case anything did happen, and it did. It went to one side and upset the gondola it was in, kicked the trucks out from under the car body, tore up the railroad track, and it made an additional work, to say the least. So we had to set it aside with our cranes and rebuild the trucks on the gondola it was setting in, put them in place, and put the gondola back on the rails. And finally we got Ethel back in place. Got her blocked down, and as far as we know, she hit Cincinnati and was moved on to her destination. That little experience took us about 3 days to, everybody in Altoona knew what was going on, I guess, I don't know, but it was sort of a dramatic experience, so to speak. And of course, then in, I think it was 1976, I'm just going to point out a few things. The Freedom Train was going throughout the country, and it was coming into Altoona. It was going to go up over the Horseshoe Curve and on to western points. And when it stopped in Altoona, I took one of the other general foremen with me who never saw a steam engine. And I took him over to the station where it was being serviced, and I never forget, I took him up into the cab, and I opened the fire doors, and he looked in there, and there was a bed of coals in there about 6 to 8 inches deep, red hot. You'd think you was looking at hell yourself in the way people describe it, but he looked in there at that firebox, and his eyes got as big as saucers. He never saw anything like that before. Well, that was a pretty nice experience, that. And we put a pair of helpers on the front end of that train, take it up over the mountain. They stopped at the Horseshoe Curve, the center of it, and people all around wanted to take a lot of pictures of this train. And it was a pretty heavy attraction at that particular time. So that was another of our experiences. Probably the best one was a wreck at Tyrone, Pennsylvania. It was a coal train. Was loaded going east, and one of the lead cars in the train turned over. We never did determine what was actually the cause, but nevertheless, there was about 50 cars. I couldn't believe my eyes when they walked up that track and saw that coal was everywhere. Some of the cars were almost buried in it, and the wheels and the trucks that they fit in to carry the cars was just one big mess. All lines were blocked, and that was Thanksgiving Day. I mean, I got a phone call just after we finished eating our dinner, and I was given this information. I couldn't believe it. So that ended Thanksgiving holidays for the Bretz family. But we spent I went out there right away, and of course a lot of the emergency crews were being called to participate, and I just can't remember the number exactly, but I think there was about 50 cars that was involved in that derailment. I don't think there's been anything ever took place like that before or after in that particular area since, but we had to sort it out, and these cars that were damaged, we sent them off to one side. Thank goodness. I don't know if it was Conrail then or not. I don't believe it was. Yeah, I guess it was Conrail, and had to pull cars off the main line and set them in a way that we had to scrap them. They were just beyond repair. That took about 2 weeks, and we called the personnel department called some men back that had been furloughed, and right before Christmas. And these boys worked there for 2 weeks with us to clear up this mess. You looked in the firebox, there was tubes in there about that big around. There was 4 of them, I think 4 or 5, run parallel with the engine, with the length of the firebox. On head sheet, which is right where we were standing, where the water bottle is and all that, all those, let's see, water bottles is on there, and the throttle and whatever. Well, there's plugs up there. And those plugs, when you take them out, you can see right down in those arch tubes. And of course, when that engine was running, that water wasn't just laying in there. That water was being turned to steam, and it was roiling around all the time, you know. And one of the major areas to help generate steam was these tubes. And they didn't call them tubes; they called them probably arch tubes. Then they were about that big around. Then on top of them was arch brick. They made arch brick down at somewhere around Denholm. There was a brick factory, and those bricks were they would lay on these on the tubes, arch tubes, and they were from the front end of the firebox down to throat. They called that the throat, down at the end, the front end of the firebox. That curved up a little bit and went in a little bit, and then you got that the sheet, the whole front of or the back end of the boiler was built into the engine, and the rest of the other areas of it, you know, the rounded out part. And of course, there's where your those tubes went down in that arch part and right in front of the firebox, on the front end of it. They went down in there, and the arch brick went over that. The purpose of that was to direct the heat in the proper fashion. They wanted that heat to come back under the arches, and with the exhaust pulling, that exhaust, boy, that really makes a draft. They wanted to combine all that heat in a combined area as much as they can, not lose any of the heat. And it would come back, and then the exhaust was sucking that air out, so to speak. But instead of going right up out of the firebox, it came back under the arch brick. Man, they'd get red hot. And it would go up over that way, out into the boiler. Well, that is part of the boiler. Into the tubes. You can't even, they weren't arch tubes, your boiler tubes that run the length of the engine, see, and water was all around them, and as they went out to the front of the engine. Well, then arch brick would fall down from time to time, or a guy get in there with a poker, you know, and try to poke out some big clinkers. You get clinkers in them like this. They're huge. And you'd have to try to bust them up to get them down through the grates. And that arch brick sometimes would lay down in there in a grate and get caught. And a lot of times they had a Boilermaker assigned to the ash pit. That was his job at the ash pit. If there was something that needed to be done, if there was leaking flues or leaking tubes and part of the flues, they had a leak in. He was called a hot leak man, and that's all he did. He'd get in there, they'd shovel the hot coals all to one side. On the pit, they knew that the hot leak man was going to have work in there. They'd clean the fire, get all the clinkers out, save some of the coal, or the hot coals, and shove them to one side of the firebox. And he would get a plank and lay down in there, and he would go up there and have to move arch brick or something to take up a leak. Go in there with a hose and a pneumatic hammer, and they'd pull the pressure down in the bottom in the boiler as much as they could. There was nothing under 205 pounds. That was your shifters and your M1s, the first ones they had. It was all And of course, it went up to 2 for the road engines. It was 240, I think, is where when they designed the engines to be more efficient and more powerful. But he would have to go in there in that heat and take a pneumatic gun in there and try to bead that weld or whatever to stop the leaks. Or the stay bolts, or the bolts down in the throat sheet, which is down, the firebox goes down and the boiler goes up like this, and there's a little shelf in there like, well, down in where that shelf goes up, where that's a straight part, you can see it in there, there's stay bolts in there. And if he had a leak in there, he would have to go in there and try to I never heard of anyone getting injured in any way, except that heat. And they'd go in there with a pneumatic gun with a tool, and they would try to go around that stay bolt. Probably maybe didn't call them stay bolts in that area, but he'd try to take up them leaks. Crews, that's the first place a crew looked at when they got on an engine. I don't think that it would have hurt anything from to run them that way, but I don't think the ICC or the FRA today would have. If they look in there and see a leak, they were pretty specific on that. Well, we were talking about those caps on those stay bolts outside. They didn't call every bolt that held that boiler together. See, that's what they did. They held the boiler together, and of course the water circulated in there. And they didn't call all of them stay bolts. It's the term I'm using here. They did some, but they might have called them crown bolts or something up in the higher part of the boiler. I worked in that gang for 2 weeks when I hired into labor, you know, and labor was the lowest paid individual. He cleaned the pits. They used a material on the steam engines called MODOK. It was a real thick. It was all you would have thought it was mud, but they had what they called waste. They had a plant there that made it out of what I don't know what the material was they made it out of. But when you worked on an engine, you had waste in your pockets when you clean your hands off, you know, and. When you labored, you had a container with MODOK. That's the name of the material. Probably came from a factory that, prepared it. And you'd put MODOK on that waste, and then you'd get up on that engine. And there wasn't no steam in them then either. Well, when they were getting fired up and the tests are being made, the MODOK guys were generally on there. And they would go over that sheet metal that covers the engine and the boiler, not in the cab or anything like that, but on the outer surfaces. Man, the engine come out of there and looked like it was brand new. It did a nice job. It just washed like you were washing your car. They would use this stuff on there. Then you took a dry piece and you wiped it off, and they glistened when they come out of the shop. Like everybody knew there would come out of. Seen one in the yards there or something that had just come out of the shop because that's what it was done.
Clean them too often, did they?
No, no. I think they're a little more. Well, I don't know about now. We had a wash rack down in Enola at the lower end of the shop. They built it just for diesels. And they had revolving brushes, you know, I don't know if you've ever seen them or not. Mm-hmm. You run the engine through there, and I don't know, can't remember seeing anybody on the engine in the diesel house. I think they did do some wiping down in there if something was used, or maybe some lube oil got spilt or something. Yeah, they did look after him a good bit. Now, the FRA get on their butt if they left anything, man would slip, you know. Oh man, that young kid I was telling you about, he was a train master. he about drove me nuts, but my wife and I used to laugh at him. And his wife, she would come out to his office. He had an office in, where did he have his office? Can't remember, but his wife would come out and they had one little child. And she didn't like to be away from her home, which was somewhere out around Conway or something like that, you know. And she didn't want to move around. Well, you got them jobs on the railroad, brother. You're going to move around, or you ain't going to have that job. He came into my office one day all shook up. This business train was coming into Altoona. And I don't know what had to be done, what was going to be they were going to try to do. But it was in his hands, it was on his territory. He said, they want to take this train out there to Y switches, Route 22. You know where Route 22 is. Run right through Hollidaysburg and straight up there for about 3 miles and started up over the Allegheny Mountains. Well, Y switches also, it was a secondary line coming out of Altoona, and they had plants to service down in that area. And they also had the mule shoe. That was an early, you've heard of the mule shoe? Well, they were still using that when I lived up there. I told you that, didn't I? I could look out and see that train going up over the mule shoe there. Stand down there and catching trout and watch the train going by. The only place we really had to turn engines, we didn't have a or a turntable no more there. And I was there when they tore the old steam house down. That was supposed to be the largest engine roundhouse in the world. Well, that's where I started my work as a supervisor up there in that big building. And they tore the whole thing down. Anyway, he said, I'm supposed to take this business car out to Y switches. He didn't know nothing about Y switches yet. And I insisted, and I left my work and went along with him, and I didn't do anything. The crew knew what they were supposed to do, and him and I sat back in the business car and waved bye-bye to everybody. But I just wonder where that car is.
Was that with Conrail?
Yeah. Yeah, after somewhere in the 70s, Conrail. I'll tell you, when Conrail was formed, when Reagan was in, and Bob Dole's wife, what's her name? Elizabeth. She was Secretary of Transportation. And she had to have some knowledgeable people concerning transportation, railroad for one of them. She didn't know anything about railroads. She did a great job to the best of her abilities, I understand it. She had to have good people working on you. When you got a position like that, those people working under you, they're going to make you or break you. And if you got good people, you can sail through. But that Conrail was being developed at that time, and she was a secretary. But see, when Conrail downsized in it started before 82, but I was still in Altoona until May. And my job was intact. That position in Altoona on the Allegheny Division, it had to be there because you had wrecks on the mountain and you had stuff coming out of Altoona Works, which wasn't any part of the Allegheny Division. That was a manufacturing plant all its own, so to speak. Well, the vice president of operations his office was in Philadelphia. I mean, that's where all the bigwigs were. But he worked his way up through too. And Conrail had to downsize to get some cut their expenses. So we had a nice shop. I don't know if you've ever seen an Ola's car shop or not.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we had one just like that. at eastbound. That's where the big roundhouse was. That was in East. There was 5,000 people employed up there at one time. Man, I could never believe that. And there was machinists and pipe fitters, and that was bigger than Enola, boy, and they had a lot of people. And there was a lot of work, and boy, all kinds of them J1s, and there was another engine that was huge. I think it had an air compressor on each side on the front end, and it had 5 drivers. It didn't have, the M1 has 4.
I-1?
No, it wasn't the I-1. The I-1 was there, but this other one was bigger. I think they got them from out of the West or somewhere or other. Anyway, I can't remember the general superintendent of the Altoona Works. Now, he was called a general superintendent, but his ranking was equal to a vice president. They had a number of guys, vice president of transportation, vice president of maintenance away, buildings and structures. You know, they were pretty good jobs. And this vice president of operations included rolling stock. You know what I mean by rolling stock? So he was going around. He came in to Pittsburgh. That was our headquarters for the division, for the central region. They had 5 or 6 regions. They broke it down into 5 or 6 regions. And the central region was where the Allegheny Division fit in. You know where I'm going with this now? You got the picture? So he came to, on the central region, you know how rumors fly around. Everybody was scared to death of him. He was going into the shops and, you know, opening doors and opening file cabinets and looking to see what things were going. He just did that. He didn't mean anything really about that other than to get people wakened up. You know, you work in one position for a long time and never move. Some of the people sit at a desk and they come in the morning at 8 o'clock and they do whatever they're doing, and lunch and in the afternoon and home. That's it. Well, you get into this is true. I learned this. I went to a meeting out there in Green Tree where the Central Region had its main offices. They had all the supervision in from, well, I think they just called in certain ones that had really responsible jobs. General foreman on up, I don't think, master mechanics were involved in that. And they got into a subject of what would you call it when, just like I explained to you, you get fixed in a job and you just, you can't see anything else around you. You just, like a general foreman. He could walk through his shop every day, which I did, and all the others did too. And somebody else come in and inspect your shop, and they'd show you things that you didn't even really realize what they were. That's true. And the Swanson, it was his name, Donald D.R. Swanson. I really liked the man. He was all business, as far as I was concerned. He would come into shops, you know, and I'll give you one illustration. We had a interior lining program. They didn't call it that. You would renew the grain cars, for example. Some grain cars. Cars that had to be pretty good shape, and a lot of them weren't. They were out the railroad too long, going to this plant, digging this out. Some guy hit the side of it with a forklift and smashed the lining or something. You know, load the car and send it on. Same thing happened there. Well, we had a freight car door program at eastbound. That's where I was assigned, at eastbound. I don't say this boastfully, man, but I had more work there than most any. When I was in supervisor in materials and what was the other title I gave it? They'd given them materials and equipment. If any of our equipment went bad in the shop, they'd run it through me, and I'd have to see outside of repair work, you know, away from anything we had. And Swanson, we got the word from Pittsburgh that Swanson was coming into eastbound. Well, the general foreman at that time, I don't know where he was, but he was out of town. And the assistant foreman from up in the yard, we had an assistant foreman out in the yard there too. And I think they did have it, Enola back over the years. Well, they almost had to, it's too big. And this assistant foreman, Lynn, I can't remember Lynn's last name. He worked in the yard, I think, out around the Pitcairn or one of them places out there. And they couldn't get anybody to move to take this job out in the yards at Altoona. So he took it. Well, when we heard that Swanson was going to come in and do an inspection of the shop, well, I didn't worry about my men or my materials or whatever I was assigned to. I kept on top of it pretty much. I could see around the guys that didn't, they got chewed. I didn't want anything like that. Swanson comes in, and they had told him when Swanson came, they told him to come down and fill in there because the general foreman was out of town. And he was supposed to meet Swanson, and they always do that. And when a dignitary comes in, if you're the responsible supervisor, then you go with that out of town. A lot of guys got scared about that kind of stuff. Well, old Lynn, he was scared of Swanson, so Pittsburgh called me and asked me if I'd go with him. So I did, and oh man, he didn't know that. He never worked in the shop. Some of that stuff Swanson, he would ask him, he didn't know anything about it, I'd say, and tell him what it was or whatever. You know, bearings were put in racks right along where the men worked. They wanted to get away from having to take carts and shove material from one end of the shop to the other. And they did that. They set up racks with bolts and nuts and all kinds of stuff that you use on cars right where you're working. You wouldn't have to walk 4 or 5 car lengths or something. In some areas they couldn't do that, but they did that. And he was asking Lynn about different things, and he didn't know anything. And I felt sorry for him. I knew it because I was in there all the time. My men were going around checking whether this bin had what it needed, you know. And the doors, I had a man on doors all the time up in the yard. And Swanson wanted to go up and see the doors. You know, I was telling you about the lining in the cars. Remember just a few minutes ago? Swanson gets up there and he shoves the door open. He looks in there, he says, "You got a bar around here?" And he starts to shake, and he got a bar. And old Swanson takes the bar. And he was just doing this for, I don't know how you'd call it. It was one of those things that he worked on you mentally, you know what I'm saying? He took that bar, and they'd already finished the car, and he got in behind that lining and jerked it loose. He said, how's the other word? Well, all you have to do is fit this up and then nail it right to the old lining, huh? Something like that. And old Lenny, he didn't know what was going on. And well, as far as I was concerned, that was over the hill. Well, then when they asked me to take a job in the mechanical department there in Altoona, that made it a little different. And I was responsible for all the coal trains that come off of the mountain up around
Crescent.
Well, Crescent, but all of them came into Crescent, and they would they used to store them there. They had a small yard. They did to a certain extent, but what they liked to do was send a complete train out to the mines. and have it loaded. Mine 33 right along Route 22. You go up over the mountain, go through Crescent, and you go out there about 10 mile. And there was mine 33 right along Route 22, and they had X number of tracks, and they would just shove them cars through there. And that conveyor was loading them cars up. They'd load a car and unload a train in 2 hours, maybe a little more, a little less. It all depends. Man, that really saved a lot of time. And they'd get a crew in there, Pensy, hook onto one track, pull her down, switch it, move back, pick up another track. They'd take 115 cars, 120 cars down off of that mountain, down through Crescent, Altoona, and on down here to along the river, a coal plant down there.
Brenner?
Huh?
Brenner's Island or York Haven?
Below York Haven. What'd you say, what island?
Brenner's Island?
Bruner's Island, yeah. That's where they turned the cars upside down. Another little aspect of that job was when the FRA came in. The general foreman, if he had an assistant, he never went out. The assistant went out. And of course, I got saddled with that position. I didn't mind it. I liked them guys. Man, I had taken, to be an FRA inspector, you had to take an examination, government examination. Back, now I'm going to tell you this, and then to get back where I was, I'm going to forget where it was going to take you. But they put a letter out, most of the railroad around here, around up there, that the FRA needed federal inspectors over the country. And they had it in a building over there. I went. I took the exam. I'd say there was between 30 and 40 men there to take that exam. I did it in my own time. I didn't get paid for it because I wasn't working in the air gang then. And I never heard from them. But I was going to tell you about the FRA people when they come in. So when I went up to Altoona, I wasn't working in the mechanical department at first, as I mentioned, I guess. And one of the FRA men, they always came into our office, you know. My job was in the same office as the general foreman of the shop, only he had a room of his own. Some places I had one of my own. And the FRA people would come in there and just talk to the general foreman about a few things or whatever. And I was they had turned that shop over to Altoona Works. I don't know if they're still using it or not. It was a nice shop. And they sent us out gave us a couple cars and sent eastbound employees, everything. We did it eastbound, sent us out to Hollidaysburg at Madden Street, which is about a half mile away from Sam Ray's shop. You ever see Sam Ray's shop?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's about a mile long or something.
Yeah.
I can't be sure. Well, we had the division. There's a yards out there at Hollidaysburg. I don't know if it's still there or not. It probably is. Handled local stuff, you know. And then the local crews would take it to the destination around there. That's the way it is everywhere. And they gave us a car. Well, they gave me a car for materials and equipment and whatever. And they sent a man in and built me an office in there. And the other car was a former passenger car. They built tables in there for the men to eat their lunch, and sort of a dining thing. And then they had offices on the one end for the gang foreman to do their paperwork on cars, and the general foreman and the assistant was in the other end. Well, the FRA people, when they would tour the Hollidaysburg yard or something, they knew we were out there, of course, and our people were the ones that was doing the work in the yard. course, they were interested in that primarily for that reason. I think they went in Altoona yards in us too, because we still had men working in there. Because we stored big coal trains in there, for 4 or 5 tracks, coal trains. But they come into that car that had the offices in, and I would talk to them a little bit. I would say greetings to all those of you who are viewing this little part of perhaps your life. Maybe I can add a little bit to it for you. My name's Don Bretz, and I spent 44 years working on the railroad, and except for a year and a half in the military, but it's been a real ride, and it doesn't have to be on the rails most of the time. And, I grew up in a small town in West Fairview. It's a railroad town at that time, and members of my family also were railroaders, so I went into the shops where we repaired locomotives and spent a number of years there. And during the course of the time, a fellow railroader approached me and spoke to me about the Bible and some of the things that were very important. And I was raised in a church, but I had no idea what he had in mind, and he gave me his testimony, and I was rather impressed. And so we parted our ways, but the next Sunday morning, he's sitting in my church in one of the pews after the Sunday school hour. I thought that was unusual. I never had anyone do that before. After the service, he got a hold of the pastor and we went to the Sunday school rooms, and we discussed some spiritual matters there for a little while, and of course then we separated. I didn't see the man that spoke to me personally, and after about 50 years, I don't think I can even remember his name, but he was quite a testimony, and quite a man that was interested in the personal life of other people concerning their spiritual needs. I sure had one, I knew that. But nevertheless, a brief period of time later, my wife and son both came to know Christ as their personal Savior in my home church. And an evangelist was invited there. And of course, they made decisions under his ministry. Now we're here with Bible Baptist in York. I might have added that we moved back to this area in 1982 we moved back, and we were in the Baptist church in Sharmanstown, and I got involved in missions there for a while. We were informed about this great work here at York, came here, and we feel this is a good home and a good place to learn about scriptures and how you should live. And it's been a great trip. It's been about 51 years or so as a Christian, and I wouldn't exchange it for all the money in the world or anything else that the world might have to offer. I would recommend, if any of you listening have never made a decision for Christ, you best do that before. You have no idea how long you're going to live or what's going to take place. And we've seen people that just turned their head away and said no, and they went out into eternity. We never know whatever became of them as far as that's concerned. So I would say that there's nothing surpasses the Christian life. Having a personal relationship with the Lord Jesus and learning some of those Bible verses and studying the books of the Bible. Paul's special presentation of about 13 books he wrote for the Christians and in the New Testament. And I would recommend that highly for anyone.
Thank you for watching Rails Around York. Call 843-7722 with your comments.
Good night.
Rails Around York is a Good Day production.